Oh, we're thrilled to have you joining in. I'm going to give you a nice official introduction right now. So we've got Ashlan Philippe Cousteau joining us, ocean explorers, adventurers, environmental advocates, and filmmakers with a deep mutual passion for exploration and storytelling. Philippe is a third generation legend of the legendary Cousteau family, an Emmy-nominated TV host, author, speaker, and social entrepreneur. Along with his sister Alexandra, founded Earth Echo International, a nonprofit founded on the belief that youth have the power to change our planet, inspiring our young people worldwide to act now for a sustainable future. Ashlan is also passionate about environmental issues. She's been recognized in international media for her work in conservation, and at the request of the United Nations, she served as the host for the UN's Convention on Migratory Species in Quito, Ecuador. So it's absolutely incredible to have the two of you joining us live today. We can't wait to dive into a little bit of your adventures around biodiversity and then have a little bit of Q&A time at the end.
Terrific. Well,
first we have to say, A, we love your t-shirt.
yeah.
And B, the poster behind you is amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, growing up, you know, your grandfather was a hero of mine. I've been diving for well over a decade. Just an amazing ocean legacy, and it's incredible to see the two of you continuing it the way that you are.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us be a part of this, man. We're thrilled.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, let's get into it. What should we talk about today?
Well, we thought we'd talk a little about the ocean, and you know, some of the solutions, some of the things we emailed back and forth with before, and a little bit of focus on, you know, there's a lot of bad news out there right now, but there are some good things that are happening, some good things we can learn about nature's resilience. So we thought we'd kind of talk a little bit about some of the challenges, recap some of the challenges facing the ocean, and some things we can do about it, and our focus on youth. And then I know we have a Q&A plan and all sorts of fun stuff packed into 25 minutes.
So we'll try to be as succinct as possible.
That's right.
So, you know, one thing that we always like to start with is to try to, you know, get everybody on the same page, right? So for those of you that don't know, but I bet many of you do, that our ocean is vital to life on this planet as we know it. You know, our planet is 70% covered by our oceans, which is a lot. So if actually we probably were naming the planet, a better name would have been ocean rather than Earth.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, you think about the ocean, and unfortunately, even still today, it gets not enough credit. What, you know, a lot of issues like climate change we talk about, that's an ocean problem. Yeah. And climate change's scary cousin, ocean acidification, is also related to carbon, and is one of those big things that not enough people recognize is a real challenge and a real problem for all of us. So yeah, so the ocean is something that we're advocates for and always talking about and yelling from the rooftops about. And so we thought we'd maybe start with kind of the top 3 kind of challenges facing the ocean right now, and then some of the things we can do about it.
So one of the challenges, one of the biggest challenges facing our ocean is pollution. Now, we all know about plastic pollution because thankfully it gets a lot of press, but we have about 8 million metric tons of plastic entering our ocean every year. And that's on top of what we think, our best guess is about 100 million metric tons of plastic already in the sea. So that is at a rate of one giant New York City garbage truck dumping plastic into the ocean every single minute. Every minute. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah, it's pretty shocking.
But not only is, you know, it's not just plastic. Well, if we keep at this rate, then scientists suspect that we'll actually have more plastic in our ocean than fish in 2050. That is super creepy.
Yeah, it's particularly scary. Like, what do you call a vast area that is filled with mostly trash? More trash than anything else. A dump, right? So to think that humans could turn the oceans into a dump in 50 years is pretty horrifying. Anyway,
but it's not just plastic. It's not just plastic. We have chemical runoff. We have agricultural runoff. We have what else do we have? Specifically pollution, but
well, human waste that's going into the coastlines around the world. Dead zones that are a huge problem.
Great dead zones, yeah.
You know, there are dead zones in every country in the world and every major body of water in the world. Probably one of the most famous in the United States is the big dead zone that exists in the Gulf of Mexico. That's several times larger than the state of New Jersey. Every summer, when agricultural runoff coming from the central, you know, agricultural heartland of the United States comes down the Mississippi River, flows into the Gulf of Mexico. and creates a tremendous amount of pollution that causes the oxygen levels in the water to decline, so nothing can really breathe and live. So
Hence
pollution,
dead zone.
yeah, hence dead zone.
So pollution, and then you want to
and then fisheries, right? So global fisheries are also declining at a precipitous rate. 90% of the world's fisheries are either fished to capacity or overfished. And, you know, that's important because there's a lot of people around the world that rely on seafood for their livelihoods and also to feed their families. And as those resources decline, we have major problems for people and the planet.
Yeah. And Philippe touched on climate change and carbon. And that's true. I would say those are our top three ocean issues. But
because of climate change, of course, the oceans are warming. The oceans are a heat sink. They're also a carbon sink. So in other words, they absorb heat. They've done a great service to humanity because they've absorbed the majority of the extra heat in our atmosphere over the last 50 years or 100 years, I should say, or so. But because of that, they're warming. And so sea level rise is predominantly, at least currently, caused by actually warming oceans, because what happens when things warm, they expand. That may at some point be overtaken by places like Antarctica. You know, if all the ice melted in Antarctica, it would raise ocean levels by 60 meters or so. So well over, you know, about 180 feet, can you imagine? But right now it's predominantly the warming of the oceans that's causing sea level rise. And also making storms more serious and more devastating around the world. And then there's ocean acidification. I think it's worth explaining a little bit about that, just because a lot of people don't know what that is. The oceans absorb carbon. They're a carbon sink, and that causes the oceans to become more acidic. Interestingly enough, the level of pH in the ocean is roughly the same about the level in our bodies. And the oceans have been getting slowly more acidic over the last century or so, predominantly over the last 50 years, really been accelerating as it absorbs that carbon. And as the oceans become more acidic, all the different creatures that create shells out of calcium carbonate in the ocean, things like coral reefs, oysters, shrimp, tiny little free-swimming ocean snails called pteropods, various planktonic organisms, all these different things that are at the top or certainly at the base of the food web, all the way through to almost the top in some cases, in some trophic levels. Jinx, yes. All those animals are unable to bind the calcium ions with carbonate in the ocean to create their shells. And so if you start thinking about all the animals that make shells are unable to or unhealthy because they can't make strong shells in the ocean, you're talking about a devastating chain domino effect throughout the food web of the ocean, right? So ocean acidification is also very scary and has huge impact on the health of the ocean. So those are kind of the three things we wanted to get us all on the same page here. But I think the biggest problem facing the ocean is
we don't connect the dots. So when a lot of people think about the ocean, they think maybe it doesn't pertain to them, but 2 out of every 3 of our breaths are actually the oxygen has been provided to us by the ocean. And what we don't really think about is, or we think, oh, I don't eat seafood, so it doesn't matter that their fish are declining or things like that. But you know, we always kind of like to tell the story of in the 90s. Somalia was facing a civil war, and because of that civil war, the Coast Guard wasn't able to patrol their coast. And this was a fertile, it still is, it is a fertile, amazing coast with incredible fishing that had sustained these local fishermen for generations. Well, when the Coast Guard wasn't able to patrol the waters, all of the fishing vessels from different countries, the United States, Russia, the EU, China, I mean, everybody came in and started pulling out as many fish as they possibly could.
It was like $200 million worth of fish every year.
200 million every year. So the locals, they were trying to protect their fish from these big giant boats, and because they weren't even able to feed their own children because the big fishing vessels were just sucking up everything. So those fishermen decided to try to come together and go out in the water and try to scare those boats. Well, their little boats didn't scare the big boats. So then they started arming themselves and they started shooting at the big boats. The big boats didn't care. Well, one day, one of the groups was able to board the big boat and yell at them with guns and tell them to leave. And then all of a sudden, they got paid a ransom for that fishing boat. And they said, huh, okay, well, we can't make money fishing anymore because there's no more fish left. So this is how we're going to have to make a living. Well, that in turn is how the Somali pirates started.
Mm-hmm.
And the Somali pirates have killed many people. They have taken countless money out of our global economy.
Yeah.
And really all it started because people were overfishing their lands.
Yeah, and what's really crazy to think about is that 20 or so percent of global commerce passes through the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea. That's been impacted by this. All the billions and billions of dollars the United States and other countries have spent on having their military in the region to try and protect this shipping, and also the fact that this is also interesting. A lot of the organizations that then got involved in the piracy and sponsoring and giving weapons to these pirates were terrorist organizations like Al Qaeda in the Maghreb, like Al Shabaab, which then have been responsible for thousands of lives, displacing hundreds of thousands of people, and again costing billions of dollars to these nations and to the global economy. And there was an interesting report by the Department of Defense here in the United States that I read. And the summary of this report, that it was a research study all about this crisis, that the Somali piracy, basically what it said, and I paraphrase it, but it said a few $1 million of fisheries conservation work in Somalia could have avoided all of that, could have saved countless lives, hundreds of billions of dollars in treasure, and could have helped to prevent, this is a very military term, but the metastasizing or the growth of terrorist organizations in that part of Africa. Imagine a few $1 million of fisheries conservation work could have prevented all of that. So that's a great example of connecting the dots.
Connecting the dots. It's not just about polar bears, hungry polar bears. It's not just about fish that are being overfished. It's about people and how we're all connected by the ocean.
So our health, our economy, our security, it's all impacted by those things. So there's some challenges that we're facing.
Yep.
What are the solutions?
Yeah, because we don't want to just be totally Debbie Downers over here today.
Exactly.
So we know there are things that can work. Fishing regulation works. The saying that if you fish less, you actually catch more is very true.
Mm-hmm.
So going out and identifying specific fish that should be caught at specific time in specific areas, that's great. And
allows those fisheries to be healthy, to have more fish, and thus you can catch more of them if you fish less. I mean, It seems counterintuitive, but from a sustainability perspective, that's how it works.
And then the other big tool that we have in our tool shed is marine protected areas. Yeah. And we know that those work. So Philippe and I have seen that firsthand in many locations. But my favorite location that I've seen was out in the Marshall Islands. And that is where the United States did most of our nuclear testing during the Cold War. And we went out and so the US had pretty much completely decimated this little atoll called Bikini Atoll. And, when nuclear bombs go off, as many of you know, nothing really survives. So the complete ecosystem was wiped out. The blast was so hot, it actually turned part of Bikini Atoll's sand into glass. So it actually vaporized the island.
It was 1,000 times stronger than the bombs we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
But 60 years later, Philippe and I went back to see how the shark, specifically the shark populations, had returned. But what we saw was not just a very healthy shark population, it was a very healthy everything. Because for those 60 years, really nobody went out there and nobody bothered it. So nature was able to not only recover, but to thrive.
So we know that, and we've also seen in this current pandemic, there have been lots of things on social media about, jellyfish and octopus in the clear canals of Venice, and sawfish in Biscayne Bay and Miami. All of these different things that we've seen really help demonstrate what we saw in the Marshalls and have seen other places, is that nature's resilient. Yeah. So that one of the key strategies that we know works for ocean conservation is to set aside parts of the ocean to be protected, marine protected areas. And there's a campaign right now called 30 by 30, and that is to advance and protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. This was a challenge that was issued by E.O. Wilson, the eminent Harvard biologist, to say that in order to to stop the worst of the biodiversity decline in the ocean, we need to at least have 30% of the most productive and biodiverse parts of the ocean protected. And also, when we know they're protected, we know they're healthy, they'll be more resilient against climate change and ocean acidification. So what that means is we have to stop overfishing, dumping pollution, things like that. And there's a lot of effort now and a growing movement of lots of different organizations around the world and young people and individual citizens that are saying this is a really effective strategy and we need to pursue it. So that's kind of one of the hopeful things we wanted to share with you all, is the idea that protecting areas in nature works.
Yep.
And that's one of the key things that we can do that's actionable and hopeful and positive going forward to protect the ocean and thus ourselves. So I think
woo.
in 20 minutes, I think a little less than 20 minutes. So
no, I think you nailed it. I was going to pop in and maybe ask some questions, but you guys had such a good rhythm going and you hit all the big points, the things we're seeing, what's at stake. And, you know, there are solutions, and sometimes it is just giving space. If we give the ocean space, it's resilient. And we've seen examples of that around the world when that does happen in those marine protected areas. And then the fish leave those areas and can then be harvested sustainably. It's
exactly. They always say fish don't understand where the marine protected area is. They don't know where the boundaries are. So yes, if you protect a specific area, it only makes that area healthier and thriving, but it also is an overspill to everywhere else. So it really just benefits everyone.
Yeah. And that story you shared, you know, in Somalia in those waters really hits home another big point we want to talk about all this weekend is we depend on biodiversity for survival. And when we lose biodiversity, whether on land or in the ocean, we're going to feel it. And that is a perfect story to illustrate that kind of cascading effect of the loss of that biodiversity.
Exactly. I mean, and I'm sure you've talked about this many times today, but Philippe is 40 and I'm getting to 40. But to think that we've lost half the biodiversity on this planet in our lifetime is crazy.
It is crazy. We have a daughter turning 1 year old tomorrow, and you know, to think what's happened in my lifetime and what she's inherited already is shocking. You know, really since Voyage to the Edge of the World, the poster behind you is from I think was that their trip to Antarctica, and you know, that was in the early 70s that they went down there. So in that period of you know, in less than that period of time, we've lost half the biodiversity on Earth. That's really outrage. But we do know that nature is resilient and that when we give her a chance, she can recover. And that's good for people too, right? So if we think about, for example, as we look at protecting coral reef areas, for example, right, and making sure that as warming oceans accelerate, that reefs are healthy. That has so many knockoff effects on the health of individuals, right? So when you think of, for example, 40% of the children of Filipino fishermen are malnourished because there's not enough fish, because they've degraded those coral reefs to such a degree, and they have to sell what they catch in order to just make enough money to have a roof over their house, over their heads. And they're kind of forced to feed their children noodles and things like that. That's not enough nutritional benefit. So, you know, when we degrade reefs, when we degrade these systems of biodiversity, it has a huge impact on people. And so then what are other consequential domino effect of that is when people can't feed their families, what do? They migrate, they move, they go other places. And we've seen the kind of conflict that has occurred over the last few years because of mass migration of people. And so people really need to understand and connect the dots that when we see fisheries declining around the world, it's our problem. Yeah. When we're destroying fisheries in Somalia, it's feeding money to terrorist organizations that are costing us lives, putting our brave men and women in uniform in danger, costing us untold billions of dollars to our economy. And it has an impact.
And even something as simple as buying a beach home and deciding you want to cut down the mangroves so you can have a better view. Well, as soon as a storm comes or a hurricane comes or a storm surge, when you cut down those mangroves and you destroy your coral reef, you're unprotected from the storm. And we've seen that happen everywhere with Typhoon Haiyan and Hurricane Sandy. I mean, a lot of property damage would have been saved averted by having these healthy mangroves, healthy coastal, you know, sand dunes and healthy reefs.
Yeah, no question. I mean, that connecting the dots is such an important piece that you shared. And I think, you know, especially here in North America, other places around the world, we don't connect those dots. We only look at one small part of the story. We make our judgments before we see all of those pieces.
You know, Joe, and I think the other piece of good news that exists out there is that we have a young generation that is really fired up about these issues. The organization we founded, Earth Echo International, 15 years ago now, has become one of the leading youth environmental education organizations. I know we work together a lot on it, which is how we're connected for this. And, you know, our focus on youth is really a recognition that the younger generations are really fired up. They care about these issues. They know these issues exist, and they have the tremendous power at any age to create incredible change and effective change. And that's what gives me hope too, looking forward, is that we have a generation of young people that care. And I think in particular in this country, there's a lot of data coming out that, you know, historically these have been very politically charged issues, conservation, at least for the last few decades, and which has been a tragedy and a crisis. But that even that is much more of a bipartisan issue now for a younger generation. We're seeing an overwhelming amount of young Republicans and young Democrats that are like, okay, we can disagree on a lot of things, but clean air and clean water ain't one of them. And right now, one of the things that's really scary here in the United States in particular, but it's happening all over the world, is this narrative that, okay, in order for us to recover the economy, we need to destroy the environment. And we're starting to see that. Here, the administration in this country is like laying waste to environmental regulation, arguing that it's going to help the economy, when that's not true. And when you think, for example, in 2019, 700,000 people were employed in coal power jobs in this country. 2.3 million people, at least 2.3 million people were employed in the energy efficiency sector. So investing in clean energy, which results in clean air, which helps to reduce disease and unhealth in people, and the underlying conditions, remember, that are making people more vulnerable to COVID-19. A lot of them can be linked to environmental pollution. All of this is interlinked. So this narrative that we need to destroy the environment is immoral and untrue.
Yeah. I almost think we need an experiment here where we just flip things and put kids in charge for like a year of the government. And
I 100%, yes,
100%.
support that.
It would be a lot of fun, probably a lot of chocolate and things like that. But I think they'd really get switched on to the environmental stuff. And I think they could make a huge difference given the rain every year.
Totally.
Absolutely. Yeah, no question. So we've talked, we've shared some stories. We've shared some of the ups and the downs. We've got Jessica sent a question. She's in the Pacific Northwest in the US. And she wants to know if each of you can share a magical moment, either together or maybe a separate moment with wildlife underwater.
When we were filming, we were in Belize. Well, at least this is my moment. We were filming in Belize, and we were right around the blue hole, and we went on this dive called the aquarium, and it was aptly named because it was completely beautiful and marine protected area.
Exactly, I was gonna say, yeah.
Marine protected area. And all of a sudden I felt like, Philippe and I usually we're each other's dive buddies, but I saw Philippe, but I felt like there was something behind me. And I looked, and there was this gigantic Nassau grouper. And I had always remembered that Philippe told me that groupers like to be tickled underneath their chin, but he always told me to be very careful because they have very sharp teeth. So I don't know what possessed me, but I put my hand out and I tickled underneath his chin, and he stayed with me for the rest of the dive. And he took me around the reef, and I followed him, and he took me into the place where it must have been where he slept at night.
It's like a little cave area. And I was watching this, and Ash would be swimming with this grouper, and when she would stop to look at something, he would kind of slow down and wait for her.
Yeah.
And then she'd catch up with him, and he'd swim around, leading her on a tour of the reef. That was
so
really remarkable.
I will say that's probably one of my top three underwater, my top two underwater ocean animal stories.
I think one of my favorite experiences, I was in the Red Sea off of a place called Chabrumi off Sudan, and there's this beautiful coral reef and the ruins of an experiment my grandfather did to live underwater. Well, he didn't, but his crew did, for 30 days on conch shelf, experiment called conch shelf 2. And so there's the ruins of conch shelf, and then this beautiful coral reef, and then off in the distance, schooling hammerhead sharks, interspersed with silky sharks, giant grouper, giant clams, reef sharks all over. I mean, it was the most amazing reef I'd ever been on. And it was a place that I know my father and grandfather spent about a month diving on, 50 years ago. That was really special for me.
All right. Absolutely amazing moments. I can see why you each picked those moments. They're pretty incredible. I think we should wrap up with a question here on Slido. We've got one more that came into us, and this is obviously pretty topical. Phelan's wondering, we're seeing, she's in Colorado, we're seeing some of these impacts, right? They're small impacts with maybe us not being out as much or on the ocean as much. What do you think is one thing we can do to try and to build on this momentum? You know, it was kind of forced on us. What do you think is one thing we can do to try to build on this momentum? And, you know, I think more people are switched on now, realizing that, you know, this pandemic can be traced back in a lot of ways to habitat loss and loss of biodiversity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I would say specifically for the ocean, vote for the ocean. Figure out who is running for office, who cares about these issues. And remember, it's not just the ocean. All of our water is connected. So even if you live in Colorado, or if you live in Idaho or Indiana, you know, find those people that want healthy water systems, that want your local watershed to be healthy, and they care about it, and vote for them.
On both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, I don't care which side. But if they put our water first, then that's a good thing for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. No question. Well, Philippe and Ashlan, it's been an absolute pleasure to have a little bit of your time today on Biodiversity Day. You know, just to jam with you for a little bit about our oceans and how important they are and what we can do to help protect them. And
we're delighted.
Yes,
yeah.
and thank you. And thank you for an awesome day that's so important for all of us.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Well, again, an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Looking forward to hopefully events in the future. And
anytime, man. Anytime.
Awesome. So enjoy the rest of your day. We're going to jump to another event, but thanks so much for hanging out with us.
Cheers, man.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. Well, that was fun. That was an absolute blast to hang out with Philippe and Ashlan, sharing some really important stories, especially connecting the dots. We need to be connecting those dots because what's happening on the other side of the world is not removed from us. It's directly tied to what we're doing.